As we're hearing tonight, many have described Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a trailblazer. Amna Nawaz focuses on where that began, the work she did before she joined the Supreme Court.
Let's look now at some of the key ideas, the arguments, and decisions Ginsburg took on early in her career that helped shape history and our legal protections today. Attorney Brenda Feigen co-founded the ACLU's Women's Rights Project with Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 1972. That's where Ginsburg first worked on cases targeting discrimination on the basis of sex. And ACLU attorney Ria Tabak-Omar now heads the project. Thanks to both of you for joining us today. Brenda, I want to begin with you because it was during that time when you were with her there at the ACLU Women's Rights Project that she argued her very first case before the Supreme Court. It was for Air Force Lieutenant Sharon Frontiero, arguing that federal benefits, the laws there treated married female members of the armed forces differently than males. It was 1973. You were there in Washington with her. Tell us what it was like to watch her argue that case.
I had all these big, huge case books with me that I was prepared to use to give her the cites to the cases that she was relying on in her oral argument. I didn't need a single one of them. When we started, it was the usual oyez, oyez, and then the justices proceeded into the courtroom, and I could tell that she was nervous, but I was too. I was looking at the justices, and they were sitting there looking sort of dazed and amazed, and I wasn't sure, but I thought they were really paying attention. The problem was that not a single one of them asked a question or made a comment, which is very unusual in the Supreme Court. So she carried forth, she used citations to authors and people like Blackburn and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said that women should never be seen nor heard. It was just an amazing culmination of history that was defying the notion that women were not allowed in Illinois to be lawyers, or in Florida that women didn't have to serve on juries because we needed the protection of being able to stay home. And I just thought she nailed it. And I leaned over to her after her remarks were finished, and I said, "You're going to be the next Democratic appointee to the Supreme Court. I'm just sure of it." I was right.
Well, Ria, let me ask you, here was a woman who knew, as Brenda mentioned, what it was to be discriminated against, what it was to have your place at law school questioned, to have to hide a pregnancy to save your job, and yet it became part of her litigation strategy to pick up the cases of men, to challenge gender-based assumptions in the law. Why do you think she did that?
Well, that was one of her favorite strategies, and one of Justice Ginsburg's favorite cases to talk about was a case on behalf of a man named Stephen Weisenfeld. His wife had passed away in childbirth, and he wanted to stay home with their young son for the first several months or years in order to raise him, when he learned that he was not entitled to Social Security survivor benefits simply because he was a man. And had his wife been the one who was left alone to raise their son, she would have been entitled to benefits on their child's behalf. And what Justice Ginsburg understood is that by representing men, she helped male judges understand that sex discrimination affects all of us. It's not only women who are harmed by the stereotype that women should be caregivers and that men should be breadwinners, but it's men too who are deprived of that opportunity to really experience fully the joys of family life.
It sounds like she knew that employing empathy, getting the judges to care about the person that she was representing, would help her to make her case. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And she knew that because she lived it herself. She had been turned away from jobs simply because she was a woman. And you saw that in her advocacy. And you saw that also when she was on the bench, that she knew what it was like to stand in the shoes of some of the litigants that came before the court, to be the underdog, to be told, your kind isn't good enough, to be turned away simply because of who she was. And she carried that experience with her.
Brenda, as Ria just mentioned, it wasn't just about fighting for equal protection for women. It was equal protection for all. When it comes to cases for LGBTQ, how did she approach those? What can you tell us about why she felt those were important and how she viewed those?
I was sitting in the courtroom when she made her famous remark that basically said skim milk marriages when the DOMA case was being argued, that was defending the notion of marriage between a man and woman and not anybody else. She really cared about equal protection, and anything that denies a group of people, particularly ones with an immutable characteristic, she is in there trying to establish the equal rights of all of us.
Bria, it's fair to say she became a much more vocal critic later in her career. She was very critical of the court's conservative majority and their handling of voting rights and reproductive rights issues, and dissented quite frequently. Now, you have said that her dissents in many ways were even more important or just as important as her majority opinions. What did you mean by that? Why?
Justice Ginsburg wrote in dissent to be the moral authority for the court, because she understood the human stakes that really mattered in each case. She'd been there herself. She'd been the person who was turned away. I think the meme Notorious RBG came about because of her famous dissent in Shelby County versus Holder. This was a voting rights case where the majority really gutted what's called preclearance, an important tool that the government uses to block states and other jurisdictions from adopting discriminatory voting rules. And she said, that's like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you aren't getting wet. Making that accessible to real people and helping us to understand what she already saw, which was the Voting Rights Act, the preclearance provision, was the umbrella that was saving us from discriminatory voting practices, and that's what we needed.
Brenda, she was known for being so meticulous in her work, for being so civil in it as well, but really for being a legal tactician. But when you look at the body of her work, there had to be a very deep passion within to work so tirelessly and in such a dedicated way towards that goal of equal protection for all. Did you see that in your time with her?
Oh, absolutely. When we were working on the brief in the Frontiero case, she cited Elizabeth Cady Stanton from the Declaration of Sentiments, who was in many steps of ways that women were unequal in society and needed to be. And then, of course, the right to vote, which we only got 100 years ago. On a personal note, I just want to say that I was asked to direct the project with her in large part because I had been so active in the women's movement itself before that. And for example, the March Down Fifth Avenue was a big deal in the women's movement and in our history. And this didn't all spring out of the air. It came from the atmosphere of the time of women in the 60s and early 70s realizing that we needed to demand our rights and our power. It's not just equal rights, it's equal power in this society.
Ria, it's fair to say that legacies can take generations to form. But in what ways do you already see the legacy of Justice Ginsburg in action, and what work remains to be done?
Well, it's impossible to overstate the impact that Justice Ginsburg had on constitutional law. In 1971, the Supreme Court had never seen a law that discriminated on the basis of sex that it didn't like. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg changed all that. She brought us into this reality where it becomes unthinkable to have these policies that expressly favor men over women. Of course, what we're seeing today is that though state-sanctioned discrimination has largely been struck down, those same stereotypes, the notion that women ought to be caregivers, over workers, and the reverse for men. We see employers, housing providers, other private actors carrying out those stereotypes, which are so entrenched. But we know that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, if she could participate in oral argument from her hospital bed, then we can certainly strive to do better with every day that we have.
An extraordinary life and legacy she leaves behind. And thank you to both of you, Brenda Feigin and Ria Tabacco Marr, for joining us to remember it.